The sound of tearing paper should never echo in a multi-million-dollar boardroom. When the new chief executive officer ripped my stock grant into pieces, he had no idea he was severing the lifeline of his entire company. He thought I was a replaceable manager. He forgot one golden rule: never cross the architect holding the keys for thousands of freight trucks nationwide. My silence was not submission. It was a ticking time bomb. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. I want to thank you sincerely for your continuous support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep producing these videos. If you enjoy our content, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to exclusive, longer, and more detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story. And my name is Savannah Watson. The air in the top-floor boardroom of Velo Freight Solutions was clinically cold, pumped through overhead vents that hummed with a low, oppressive frequency. We were on the 42nd floor, overlooking the sprawling grid of Chicago, but the room itself felt like a vacuum-sealed vault. The mahogany walls absorbed the light, and the massive slab of polished oak in the center of the room served as a battlefield where careers were quietly slaughtered. I stood at the head of that table. I was 32 years old, the director of supply chain management, and I was exactly 5 minutes into the most important presentation of my life. On the enormous flat screen behind me, a series of complex data models shifted in real time. This was Nexus Root. It was my blood, my sweat, and my absolute obsession for the past 3 years. I was explaining how the algorithm dynamically adjusted freight paths based on weather patterns, traffic density, and fuel station pricing. I was in the middle of pointing out how the system had successfully cut our overall fuel expenditures by exactly 40% over the last fiscal quarter. I felt a surge of quiet pride. 40% was not just a metric, it was millions of dollars saved. It was the difference between this company bleeding cash and actually staying afloat in a vicious logistics market. Then came the clearing of a throat, a sharp, deliberate sound designed to shatter my momentum. Let us pause right there. Savannah. The voice belonged to Sterling Vance. He was the newly appointed chief executive officer, fresh out of a ruthless venture capital firm on the East Coast. Sterling did not wear clothes. He wore armor. His bespoke suit had a glossy, aggressive sheen, tailored so tightly it looked physically uncomfortable. The heavy scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne was overpowering, cutting through the sterile boardroom air like a chemical spill. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his manicured fingers, his eyes cold and entirely unimpressed by the data on the screen. "You are spending an awful lot of time talking about this routing algorithm," Sterling continued, his tone dripping with a practiced, suffocating condescension. "But let us be completely honest here. This is outdated technology. What you are showing us is just basic math wrapped up in a fancy presentation." I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. The 12 other board members sat in absolute silence, their eyes darting between us. Nobody dared to challenge the new king of the company. Sterling did not even look at the screen anymore. He focused entirely on me, projecting his authority. "We are restructuring our entire technological approach to streamline operations. Velo Freight will be migrating to an open source, third-party software starting next month. We need to cut the budget, and quite frankly, paying for the upkeep of a proprietary, clunky system like yours is no longer viable." My heart gave a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I had built that system from the ground up, but before I could formulate a diplomatic response, Sterling reached into the inner pocket of his blazer. He pulled out a folded document. I recognized the heavy textured paper immediately. It was the stock grant agreement. 3 years of relentless negotiations, 3 years of 80-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and sleeping under my desk to hit deployment deadlines. It was my equity. my physical proof of ownership in the empire I helped build. Sterling placed the document on the polished oak table. He smoothed it out with his palm. Then, he looked directly into my eyes and gave a faint, chilling smile. He gripped the top edge of the paper with both hands. The sound of thick paper tearing ripped through the silent room. He tore it cleanly in half. He stacked the halves and tore them again. The sharp, violent noise echoed against the glass walls, harsh and final. He opened his hands and let the torn pieces flutter down onto the glossy wood surface like dead leaves. "You have not created any core asset here," Sterling declared, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "And you certainly have not created anything worthy of equity. Your role is operational. You are replaceable." The board members held their breath. Some looked down at their notebooks, too cowardly to witness the execution. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. My pulse rushed in my ears, a roaring tide of adrenaline, but my face remained perfectly blank. I looked down at the shredded pieces of my future scattered across the table. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation or throw a tantrum. The toxic arrogance in the room was a tangible weight, but I refused to let it crush me. I met his gaze directly. I gave a single, slight nod. "I understand," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely empty of emotion. I calmly closed my laptop. I unplugged the presentation clicker and placed it neatly next to the torn paper. I picked up my leather bag, slid the laptop inside, and walked toward the heavy glass door. I pushed it open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the boardroom behind. I did not look back. Most people think getting fired is a loud, dramatic event. You are supposed to walk back to your desk, weeping softly, and pack a brown cardboard box with potted plants, framed photos, and coffee mugs. I did absolutely none of that. I walked straight past the rows of open-plan cubicles where my former colleagues were aggressively pretending to stare at their monitors. I did not stop at my desk. I had no sentimental attachments to company-branded stationery or ergonomic office chairs. I simply reached into the bottom drawer of my cabinet, bypassed the thick employee handbook, and retrieved a small, matte black solid-state drive. It was roughly the size of a matchbox, cold and heavy in my palm. That encrypted drive contained the original, uncompiled source code for the entire routing infrastructure. I slipped it into my coat pocket, walked out of the revolving glass doors, and stepped onto the busy, windswept streets of downtown Chicago. Sterling thought he had just amputated a redundant limb to save his company money. Let me tell you a secret that the arrogant chief executive officer failed to realize because he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the boardroom windows. Nexus Route was never the property of Velo Freight Solutions. It did not belong to the board of directors. It did not belong to the shareholders. And it certainly did not belong to Sterling Vance. 6 years ago, before the logistics company had a glossy high-rise headquarters, we were operating out of a damp, poorly ventilated warehouse on the south side. During those early, desperate days, I registered my own independent entity, Watson Logic Limited Liability Company. I built the routing algorithm on my own time, on my own personal servers, under my own corporate banner. When the company finally realized they desperately needed my software to scale up their operations, they begged for exclusive ownership. I refused to sell. Instead, I licensed the software to them through a very specific, ironclad contract known as the Independent Integration License. I remember the exact day I signed it. I sat in a cheap folding chair, drinking lukewarm coffee, while their old management team quickly skimmed over the technical appendix. They were far too focused on short-term profits to read the fine print. Buried deep within the legal jargon on page 47 of that contract was a fail-safe mechanism I had personally drafted, known internally as Clause 22. It was a digital tripwire, resting silently in the architecture of the code. Clause 22 explicitly stated that if the core data structure was ever modified, accessed, or interfered with by any unauthorized third-party software without my unique cryptographic key, the The system would immediately execute a self-preservation protocol. It would instantly revoke all corporate access rights. More importantly, the system would automatically revert to its primitive state, a fail-safe environment we called legacy mode. Legacy mode was not an intelligent algorithm. It was a blind, brute force randomizer. Imagine taking a handful of darts and throwing them at a map of the United States while entirely blindfolded. That was legacy mode. It assigned freight routes based on raw, unfiltered geographical proximity with zero regard for fuel efficiency, delivery windows, cargo temperature requirements, or vehicle weight limits. It was absolute chaos disguised as logistics. When I got back to my apartment, the afternoon sun was casting long, sharp shadows across my living room floor. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive hum of the corporate office I had just left. I walked over to the mahogany cabinet in the corner, pulled out a heavy crystal tumbler, and poured myself a generous measure of aged Kentucky bourbon. The amber liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me, sharpening my focus. I sat down at my personal workstation, a custom-built rig with 3 curved monitors. The screens flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across the darkened room. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. The tactile, rhythmic click of the keys was the only sound in the apartment. I took another slow sip of bourbon, savoring the deep oak and smoke flavors, and opened the remote network administration portal. It required a 16-character alphanumeric password, dual-factor authentication, and a biometric scan just to access the landing page. I did not launch a cyber attack. I did not unleash a malicious virus or maliciously delete a single line of corporate data. That would be a federal offense, and I was not a criminal. I operated with the surgical precision of a ghost. I navigated silently to the intellectual property licensing dashboard. With 3 deliberate keystrokes, I quietly toggled off the automatic renewal switch for the algorithm rights. I left the entire system running perfectly. To anyone looking at the corporate servers right then, everything appeared completely normal. The trucks were moving, the data was flowing, and the dashboard lights were all a comforting shade of green. But it was nothing more than an empty shell, a massive ghost ship sailing forward strictly on its own momentum. I had smoothly removed the foundation out from under them. Now, all I had to do was sit back in the shadows and wait for Sterling to proudly pull the trigger himself. Over the next 48 hours, my phone remained completely silent. There were no frantic calls. There were no emails demanding I hand over administrative passwords. Human Resources processed my exit paperwork, terminated my health insurance, and severed my corporate network access without asking a single technical question. Sterling and his executive team were evidently operating under the blissful delusion that they had thoroughly defeated me. They assumed my quiet exit was a sign of total humiliation, the pathetic retreat of a beaten employee who finally knew her place. They had absolutely no idea that a predator does not scream when it sets a trap. It just waits in the dark, watching the prey walk willingly into the snare. 3 days passed. Exactly 72 hours had vanished since my abrupt exit from the polished boardroom, while I was thoroughly enjoying my newfound free time, leisurely tending to my neglected houseplants and catching up on years of lost sleep. Our brilliant chief executive officer was busy executing his master plan to modernize the company. Sterling Vance, the man who believed he could conquer complex national logistics with sheer arrogance and a tight budget, proudly hired an offshore development team. It was a cut-rate outsourcing firm that promised lightning-fast software integration for pennies on the dollar. He wanted them to rip out the intricate, custom-built infrastructure I had nurtured for years and slap their generic, open-source artificial intelligence software directly on top of the severed roots. It was the digital equivalent of hiring a discount plumber to perform open-heart surgery. The new engineers were handed the keys to a kingdom they absolutely did not understand, tasked with overhauling a system designed to outsmart them at every conceivable turn. They worked under aggressive, completely unrealistic deadlines, entirely unaware that the virtual ground beneath their feet was heavily rigged with silent explosives. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Marcus. a senior database administrator, and one of the very few people at the company who actually understood how fragile the routing ecosystem truly was. The message was a mixture of utter disbelief and amusement. "You would not believe the circus in here," Marcus wrote. Sterling ordered catered champagne for the executive floor. They are literally toasting to the successful integration of the new open-source garbage. He is telling everyone they just upgraded the entire fleet tracking system without paying you a single cent. The offshore guys pushed the final code update 10 minutes ago. Everyone thinks they are geniuses. I read the text twice, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. Catered champagne. How perfectly predictable. They were eagerly celebrating a victory they had not won, entirely blind to the fact that they had just proudly kicked the tripwire I had meticulously laid down. I did not reply to Marcus. I simply poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked over to my workstation, and prepared to watch the greatest dark comedy show on Earth unfold live across my 3 monitors. The exact moment of contact was a profoundly beautiful thing to witness. On my hidden diagnostic dashboard, which I still access through an encrypted back channel securely hosted on a private server, I saw the exact millisecond the outsourced engineering team forced their clumsy artificial intelligence patch to touch the core application programming interface. It was a digital violation. The new, unauthorized code clumsily knocked on the door of the secure vault, completely bypassing the cryptographic handshake I had established. And right on cue, the cloud system responded flawlessly. Clause 22, the silent guardian resting deep within the server architecture, woke up. It did not send a polite error message to the corporate information technology department. It did not sound a warning alarm. It executed a clean, ruthless decapitation. In a fraction of a second, the system instantly verified the breach, terminated the proprietary license protocols, and slammed a heavy digital firewall between the company network and my original algorithm. The intelligent routing system was instantly vaporized from their servers, replaced seamlessly by the brute force stupidity of legacy mode. Sitting in the quiet comfort of my apartment, I watched the chaos bloom across my screens like a time-lapse video of a spectacular, catastrophic train wreck. The legacy algorithm did exactly what it was designed to do. It randomized everything. It took the massive daily influx of freight orders and began violently shuffling the deck, completely ignoring logic, geography, and basic physics. The green dots on my national map, representing thousands of massive 18-wheelers, suddenly began moving in bizarre, entirely nonsensical directions. I leaned closer to the monitor, letting out a genuine laugh. A massive fleet of refrigerated trucks carrying millions of dollars worth of premium, flash-frozen Atlantic seafood had just been rerouted away from the major grocery hubs on the East Coast. Instead, the blind algorithm confidently directed them straight toward a remote delivery coordinate deep within the scorching Nevada desert. Meanwhile, a high-security convoy hauling extremely valuable consumer electronics was inexplicably diverted from a heavily guarded distribution center in Dallas. Their new, mandatory destination was an abandoned, overgrown loading dock on the industrial outskirts of Detroit. The software was aggressively dispatching massive transport vehicles down narrow residential streets, sending hazardous materials through strict environmental protection zones, and telling drivers to pick up non-existent cargo at commercial addresses that had not existed for over 2 decades. The sheer scale of the disaster was breathtaking, an artificial hurricane tearing through the national supply chain. Yet, inside the glass tower of the corporate headquarters, the oblivious chief executive officer was entirely insulated from the bloodbath currently happening on the highways. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to LinkedIn. Sure enough, right at the top of my feed was a fresh, lengthy post from Sterling Vance. He had attached a professional, black-and-white photograph of himself looking thoughtfully out a window, arms crossed in a pose of ultimate authority. The caption was a nauseating essay about decisive leadership and corporate vision. True innovation requires making the hard choices, Sterling wrote to his thousands of followers. Today, We successfully streamlined our operational technology, cutting unnecessary intellectual property bloat and optimizing the machine for a new era of agile logistics. Never be afraid to eliminate legacy thinking to pave the way for true disruption. I read the post, chuckling softly in the silence of my apartment. He wanted true disruption, and he got it. He had absolutely no idea that out in the real world, his incredible leadership was currently sending 2 tons of frozen shrimp to a dusty truck stop outside of Las Vegas. By Friday morning, the situation escalated from a quiet, unseen technical glitch into a catastrophic, full-blown operational meltdown. The artificial hurricane made landfall on the customer service floor of the corporate headquarters, ripping through the meticulously organized department with absolute devastation. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the phone lines lit up in a synchronized, relentless wave of blinding red lights. Thousands of furious corporate clients were calling simultaneously, screaming at terrified customer support representatives who had absolutely no answers to give. Cargo valued at tens of millions of dollars had simply evaporated from the tracking grids. Major grocery chains were demanding to know why their highly perishable inventory of organic produce and premium meats was nowhere to be found, completely unaware that their temperature-controlled shipments were currently baking under the sun in a dusty lot outside of Las Vegas. Massive manufacturing plants across the Midwest were forced to halt their million-dollar assembly lines because the critical raw materials they desperately needed were sitting idle in abandoned industrial parks 2 states away. The noise on the floor was deafening, a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, panicked shouting, and the distinct, terrifying sound of a massive corporate entity suffocating in real time. Out on the interstate highways, the reality was even more bleak. Over 5,000 heavy freight trucks were effectively paralyzed, turning major shipping routes into absolute parking lots. The sophisticated global positioning system mounted on every single dashboard across the massive fleet suddenly went completely black. A few seconds later, the screens rebooted, displaying a stark, unforgiving red background with a single line of bold white text. The message read, "Loss of routing intellectual property. The drivers, confused and completely stranded at busy way stations, crowded truck stops, and on the narrow shoulders of busy freeways, tapped their screens frantically trying to clear the stubborn error. When they tried to access their digital manifest to manually figure out their routes, a secondary pop-up window appeared with a very clear, automated instruction. It politely informed the drivers that the routing software was operating illegally and instructed them to immediately contact the legal representatives of Watson Logic Limited Liability Company to restore their navigation capabilities. The company dispatchers sitting in their comfortable office chairs were entirely blind, staring at blank maps, unable to see where their massive trucks were, where they were supposed to go, or what they were even hauling. It was a complete logistical blackout. The sheer panic finally breached the reinforced glass walls of the executive suite. The general counsel and the entire legal department were thrown into a state of absolute hysteria. Sweating junior attorneys were sprinting down the carpeted hallways, their arms full of dusty, archived legal binders, desperately searching for the original vendor contracts from 6 years ago. When the chief legal officer finally located the integration agreement and turned his trembling fingers to page 47, all the blood instantly drained from his face. He read the independent integration license out loud to a room full of hyperventilating executives, including a very pale Sterling Vance. The horrifying truth finally dawned on them. They did not own the core software. They never had. Worse yet, by hiring a cheap offshore development team to forcefully rip out the code, they had just committed a massive, undeniable breach of contract. They were essentially driving thousands of stolen digital vehicles, and they had just proudly filmed themselves smashing the security alarms. They were totally exposed, legally indefensible, and bleeding cash by the second. Then came the fatal, unexpected blow that turned a corporate disaster into a national scandal. The chaos was simply too massive to contain within the private industry. By noon on Friday, The massive disruption in interstate commerce triggered emergency federal oversight. The Federal Trade Commission officially launched a rapid investigation into the company for suspected national route fraud and gross violation of interstate freight contracts. Government agents were preparing subpoenas, demanding immediate answers about the phantom shipments and the sudden collapse of a major logistics artery. News of the federal probe leaked immediately to the financial press. Major financial news networks began broadcasting the disaster live, flashing aggressive red banners across the bottom of the screen, calling it the worst logistics blackout of the decade. The internal stock valuation of the company plummeted completely, losing 60% of its value in less than 3 hours. Institutional investors, terrified by the looming federal indictments, the staggering loss of client cargo, and the sheer incompetence of the new leadership, began liquidating their positions and pulling their capital out in a massive, uncontrolled stampede. The empire was burning to the ground, taking the arrogant chief executive officer down with it. While the glass tower in the financial district was consumed by fire and panic, I was entirely detached from the destruction. I had turned my personal cell phone completely off on Thursday night and left it sitting silently in a drawer at my apartment. On Friday afternoon, I took a leisurely, unhurried stroll through Millennium Park. The crisp Chicago air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the boardroom I had left behind. I held a warm cup of artisan dark roast coffee in my hands, listening to the gentle rustling of the autumn leaves and the distant, muted sounds of the city traffic. I walked past the famous silver bean sculpture, stopping for a moment to watch the distorted reflections of the towering skyline. I did not care about the screaming executives, the panicked corporate lawyers, or the frantic offshore developers trying in vain to put the shattered digital pieces back together. I had given them exactly what they asked for. They wanted to optimize the machine without the architect. Now, they were learning the devastating, astronomical price of their arrogance, and I was simply enjoying a beautiful, peaceful afternoon walk, completely untouched by the flames roaring just a few blocks away. By Monday morning, the balance of power in the universe had completely shifted. I woke up at exactly 7 o'clock, feeling incredibly well-rested after a quiet weekend. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, enjoying the morning sunlight streaming through my apartment windows. On the other side of the city, Sterling Vance had just endured 72 hours of pure, unadulterated hell. He had not slept a single minute since Friday. The board of directors, previously a group of silent enablers who worshipped his every move, had violently turned against him over the weekend. They had cornered him in the very same glass boardroom where he had proudly ripped my equity to shreds, demanding answers he simply did not possess. At precisely 9 o'clock, my dedicated emergency landline began to ring. It was a secure phone number I kept strictly for critical server outages, a number only the top executives at the company had access to. I let it ring 4 times. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth. Before finally picking up the receiver, I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, erratic breathing on the other end of the line. "Savannah," the voice croaked. It was Sterling, but the arrogant, condescending venture capitalist from the previous week was completely gone. His voice was cracked, raw, and trembling with a pathetic desperation. The glossy armor had been completely stripped away, revealing a terrified man drowning in a disaster of his own making. "Savannah, please tell me you are listening," he pleaded, the polished corporate tone completely shattered. "We are experiencing a severe technical glitch with the new integration. The entire national fleet is grounded, the board is breathing down my neck, and the federal investigators are threatening to shut down our operating licenses. I need you to come back to the office right now. We need you to cooperate to fix this technical glitch. If you come down here and unlock the routing system, I promise I will authorize a payout of double your final month of salary. I will write the check myself. Just please, give us the administrative keys." I stood by the window, looking out at the calm morning traffic, feeling absolutely nothing for the man begging on the phone. His offer of 2 months of severance pay in exchange for saving a $1 billion logistics empire was not just insulting. It was a profound display of his continued delusion. He still thought he was in charge. He still thought I was a desperate employee willing to jump at scraps. I did not let him finish his frantic rambling. I cut him off. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or mercy, slicing through his panic like a scalpel. "Let me stop you right there. Sterling," I said, articulating every single syllable with absolute precision. "This is not a technical glitch. The system is operating exactly as it was designed to. What you are experiencing is the automatic consequence of unauthorized intellectual property theft being denied access. You broke into a secure environment, and the system locked you out to protect my assets. You do not have a software bug. You have a massive legal and financial catastrophe." "But the cargo," Sterling gasped, his voice pitching higher into a humiliating whine. "We have hundreds of thousands of tons of perishable goods rotting on the highways. The liability claims alone will bankrupt the company by Wednesday. You have to give us the application programming interface key. You built this company with us. You cannot just watch it burn." "I am not watching it burn," I replied coldly. "I am simply watching you fail, and for the record, I built the system. You just managed to destroy it in less than a week. Do not call this number again unless you are prepared to surrender." I hung up the phone, severing the connection before he could utter another pathetic word. I walked back to my computer station and opened my personal email inbox. The company had finally realized that calling me was useless. Sitting right at the top of my inbox was an urgent message from the chief legal officer. It was marked with a bright red high-importance flag. The subject line read, "Immediate resolution required without prejudice." I opened the message. The legal department, the same people who had silently watched Sterling destroy my contract just a few days ago, had completely changed their tune. The email was a masterpiece of corporate groveling. They abandoned all their aggressive legal jargon. Instead, they wrote a long, conciliatory essay, begging me to reinstate the software access to save the rotting cargo and stop the federal bleeding. They offered full amnesty, promising that no legal action would be taken against me if I simply handed over the codes. They were desperately trying to negotiate from a position of absolute weakness, hoping I would take pity on the innocent truck drivers stranded across the country. I did not feel pity. I felt clarity. The predator had officially become the prey, trapped in a cage with no exit, bleeding out for everyone to see. I did not reply to their lengthy, desperate email with a counteroffer. I did not ask for my job back. I had absolutely zero intention of ever stepping foot in that toxic office again as a subordinate. Instead, I opened a blank document and began drafting my own terms. I worked with cold, calculated efficiency, translating my leverage into undeniable financial demands. When I was finished, I exported the document as a single digital file. I attached it to a reply email directed to the chief legal officer, making sure to copy Sterling Vance and every single member of the board of directors. I did not write a polite greeting or a professional sign-off. I left the body of the email completely blank. The only thing attached was a file named Permanent Licensing Agreement. The document inside did not contain a request for a salary or a bonus. It contained unimaginable financial conditions. I demanded a massive, non-refundable reinstatement fee simply to turn the system back on. Furthermore, I demanded an astronomical, ongoing royalty payment for every single mile driven by any truck utilizing my algorithm for the rest of the company existence. The numbers I typed out were staggering, designed not just to compensate me for the stolen equity, but to completely drain the arrogance out of the executive suite. I had set the trap. They had walked into it, and now it was time to collect the ultimate toll. The PDF file I sent was not a negotiation. It was a digital guillotine. The board of directors opened that document expecting a heavy ransom, but they were absolutely not prepared for the masterclass in leverage I had just delivered. My first demand was simple but devastating. I required the exact number of shares that Sterling had arrogantly torn to shreds, but they were to be granted to me fully vested, valued at the absolute peak stock price from the day before the catastrophic crash. But that was merely the appetizer. The real twist, the clause that would ensure I owned them forever, was the continuous royalty structure. I demanded a permanent, non-negotiable licensing fee for every single mile driven by any truck using my routing system from that day forward. Every time an 18-wheeler turned a wheel on an American highway, a fraction of a cent would automatically deposit into my private bank accounts. However, financial surrender was simply not enough. I needed absolute vindication. The final, non-negotiable prerequisite for my electronic signature was deeply personal. Sterling Vance had to step down as chief executive officer immediately. Furthermore, he was required to draft and send a company-wide email to all 5,000 employees. He had to explicitly state that his arrogant mismanagement caused the entire crisis, that his technological ignorance cost the company millions of dollars, and that his resignation was the direct result of his own gross incompetence. The board of directors was completely cornered, with federal agents knocking on their doors and millions of dollars evaporating by the minute. They did not even attempt to counteroffer. Within exactly 2 hours of receiving my demands, the tyrannical reign of Sterling Vance was brutally terminated. I received a forwarded copy of his resignation email. It was a glorious read. Every single word was soaked in the bitter, undeniable reality of his defeat. Shortly after, Marcus texted me a covertly recorded video from the office. It showed Sterling, the man who wore $1,000 suits like armor, carrying a cheap cardboard box out of the glass building. He was escorted by 2 large security guards, his face pale and utterly humiliated, while the entire administrative floor watched in deafening silence. With the king officially dethroned, I opened the secure portal. I uploaded the final agreement and clicked the electronic signature box. The moment the virtual black ink stamped onto the digital document, I triggered the release protocol. It was exactly like watching a dying patient receive a massive shock from a defibrillator. In a matter of seconds, the national routing system surged back to life. The blind, chaotic matrix vanished from the corporate servers, instantly replaced by my meticulously structured algorithms. Out on the highways, the red error screens on thousands of dashboard monitors melted away, replaced by clear, optimized green pathways. The trucks magically found their bearings, turning around and heading toward their correct destinations as if waking up from a terrible, disorienting nightmare. I am no longer a salaried employee. I do not have a boss. I do not attend meaningless corporate meetings. And I certainly do not let arrogant men in expensive suits dictate my worth. I became the largest individual shareholder of the very company that tried to throw me away. I hold the absolute lifeline of their entire operation from the outside, enjoying a life of total freedom funded by an enormous passive revenue stream that flows in with every passing mile. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my new, high-rise penthouse. I poured myself a glass of vintage red wine and leaned against the cold glass railing. I looked down at the sprawling, illuminated grid of Chicago. The endless rivers of headlights flowed smoothly through the city, a beautiful testament to the invisible order I controlled. I took a slow sip of the rich wine, letting a soft, victorious smirk touch my lips. I thought about those tiny, pathetic scraps of paper scattered across the boardroom table, and how the man who tore them up had unwittingly handed me the keys to my very own empire. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city and country in the comments below. If you found my journey satisfying and enjoy these kinds of true revenge stories, please consider supporting us. You can join the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear the absolute best, most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube due to their strict policies. Just scan the QR code right here on your screen, or use the link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your support means the world to us and keeps these stories alive. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.